Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Eon Podcast. We're joined today again by Dr. Zachary Foster. 100 Days of War. What's going on, Brother Zachary? What do you think the on-ground situation in Gaza looks like right now? And do you think the Israeli war machine is slowing down or no? I mean, you saw Abu Baida's 100 days, sort of message. Was that popular in the Western media or no? I'm guessing no.
Abu Ubaida's video messages are not viewed at all in the West. There's no even a pretense of attempting to cover the Hamas official statements or the Hamas videos with regard to the military encounters with the Israeli military. Right, they've been putting out videos from the battleground of live videos of attaching anti-tank missiles to the backs of tanks, running them back into the tunnels. They've been releasing videos of them firing rockets at Israelis sitting in windows. They're releasing videos on a daily basis now for 3 months. None of that footage is viewed in the West. None of that footage is viewed on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. It's not talked about by the New York Times or Washington Post. Whereas, of course, the Israeli military propaganda is talked about in the West. It is viewed on CNN. The images released by the Israeli military of captured individuals, some of them Hamas, most of them probably not Hamas, all of that footage is viewed in the West. So there is a huge discrepancy between what the West is seeing from Hamas versus what the West is seeing from the Israeli military.
Do you think that's primarily on the mainstream media in terms of television news, and maybe that's meant for an older, sort of wiser, maybe the voter base for the two parties, but a younger audience perhaps via TikTok, via Instagram, Twitter, especially the artist formerly known as Twitter. We're talking about X here. Do you think that a lot of people have found that they're sort of sourcing their news online? And a lot of younger people are able to view these GoPro videos, as you refer to them, where the Hamas fighters attach GoPros to them, and they're directly showing, the Yasin 105 rocket in action, tank busting with the Israeli Merkava tanks, and you see them going back and out of the tunnels. They're giving a very comprehensive overview of the battle on ground, and it's fairly effective in the Muslim world. As well as the rest of the world. I feel like they're having more comfortable access to this sort of content. But do you think that the online narrative is not leaking through into the Western world, maybe on an individual level?
I think that the coverage in the West of the ICJ hearings is also quite indicative of this issue, whereby when you had the South African delegation present the 2 to 3 hours of testimony, that all of the evidence, all of the statements made by all the Israeli political and military officials, the acts of indiscriminate violence, of cutting off food, water, and electricity and fuel to all of Gaza, of the harrowing stories of destruction and death and disability and despair. None of that was aired in the West. Zero. There was no coverage. There was no coverage when the South African delegation presented the case for genocide. The next day, the Israeli delegation got up, and that was aired live on CNN. It was aired live on Fox News. It was aired live on MSNBC. The West focused significantly on the Israeli defense case, why it's not genocide, but completely omitted the case presented by South Africa for making the case for genocide. So there's just a total discrepancy. And by the way, we have now a study that was published. It was published, I believe, by The Intercept. Just maybe perhaps about a week ago. And here I'm looking at the result. I'm looking at the conclusion of this. It was an open source study published by The Intercept. Was published on January 9th, so about a week ago. And it found that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, these are left-wing publications, by the way, quote, disproportionately emphasized Israeli deaths in the conflict, used They used emotive language to describe the killing of Israelis, but not Palestinians. They offered lopsided coverage of anti Semitic acts in the US while largely ignoring anti Muslim racism after October 7th. And if you've been paying any attention, if you've been reading those publications, you would already know that. You wouldn't need an in-depth study to tell you that the coverage has been lopsided and disproportionate. But that's the reality in the U.S. is that Israeli victims are front and center, and Palestinian victims are almost completely omitted from the coverage. And it's just, and the death tolls are. Can you imagine if yesterday? Can you imagine if Hamas killed 158 Israelis yesterday on January 16th? Can you imagine that? What would the coverage be like in the West if 158 Israelis were killed yesterday? It would be the front page on every single major publication. It would be the top story on every news broadcast. And yet, yesterday, on January 16th, the Israeli military murdered 158 Palestinians in Gaza, and there's no coverage. There's no front page stories. There's no headline stories. And that's because they're fatigued. The West is fatigued. We don't really care how many Palestinians die. That's not really interesting news anymore because Palestinian life is not as valuable. And that's the perspective in the West.
I can imagine how that makes you feel, and I can see that you're quite incensed by it. But I think that it's for us in the Muslim world as well as in places like Pakistan, it's simply a repeat of what we saw post 9/11, when it came down to the Iraq War, when it came down to the Afghan War, the whole war on terror narrative. We're used to this kind of dehumanization in terms of the way we're represented in both the news media as well as media in general, whether that be film or TV. And we can get into those things later. But with regards to Palestine specifically in the mainstream news, and as you referred earlier on to that article in The Intercept, that study in The Intercept, that these are left-wing or left-leaning publishing houses. What do you think it is? Do you think it's racial? Do you think it's ethnic? Or do you think it's simply that there's no big lobbying group for the Palestinian people? There's nobody who's done the groundwork in America. Is it simply because that the Israelis and the Zionists have solid lobbies in America and historically have a relationship with the Americans? Or is it just that they're white-ish? What is it?
There's a range of problems. There's not a single problem. I think the first problem is that the age of the average New York Times staff member, journalist, editor is probably in the 40s or 50s or 60s. These are not 20-year-old, 20-something reporters and journalists working for the New York Times, right? These are legacy journalists who have been around for decades. And for the most part, boomers have outdated views on Israel-Palestine. Your average boomer grew up in a world where Israel was the good guy, where Israel was David fighting Goliath, where Israel, basically was perceived to be a democratic country, was perceived to be basically, having the moral high ground in the world, in a world where there was the PLO and the terrorists and Egypt and Syria, all backed by the Soviet Union. So Israel was this great, and so they have not been able to evolve their views into a world where, between 2008 and 2023, on the eve of October 7th, Israel is killing on average 500 Palestinians every year for 15 years. In the 20 years when boomers grew up, between 67 and 87, Israel is killing 30 Palestinians a year. So Israel has literally increased the violence by more than an order of magnitude. And then if you factor in the post-October 7th period, Israel is now killing on average about 1,800 Palestinians every year for the past 15 years. Right? So if you grew up, if you're Gen Z, if you're below the age of 26, 27, 28, and you came to intellectual maturity between the ages of 2008 and 2023, 2024, what you know is every major human rights organization now accuses Israel of practicing apartheid. Israel is killing 500 Palestinians per year before October 7th, and if you factor in after October 7th, they're killing 1,800 Palestinians every year for the past 15 years. Israel has imposed 700 military checkpoints and closing Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas. Right? Remember, if you're a boomer and you grew up in the 70s and 80s, and then especially in the 90s during the Oslo years, there was hope of peace. That you had this belief that, wow, finally Israelis and Palestinians are going to make peace and they're going to settle things peacefully. Of course, that never happened. But so I think that's one big thing, that actually the violence and the apartheid and the occupation has gotten much more violent and much more brutal. And I think that's a big factor. And the boomers, the boomer generation has just not been able to evolve their views. I think social media plays a big role. Boomers are still reading the legacy media publications. They're still watching cable news, whereas young people are not watching cable news. They're not reading the legacy media. They're following along. They're getting real-time updates. They're following along. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of journalists in Gaza reporting live on the ground what is happening on a day-to-day basis, reporting these, bread lines of thousands and thousands of people, basically clamoring for just a loaf of bread to survive. And that is being broadcasted live every day. We're seeing the genocide unfold in real time. We're seeing the starvation unfold in real time. We're seeing babies being operated on without anesthesias. We're seeing people operating on removing limbs without any type of painkiller. I mean, that is what young people are seeing on a daily basis. The horrifying images coming out of Gaza. And boomers are not on social media. They're not on Instagram and TikTok, and they're just not following along. They're just unaware is actually what's happening. They're not aware of the situation on the ground. Look, and then there's also demographic trends. In the United States, boomers are much more likely to be religious. They're much more likely to be evangelical Christian, and they're much more likely to be white. Okay, so we have religion, race, and religiosity. Young people are more likely to be people of color, people who themselves have experienced oppression, who themselves have experienced discrimination and racism, they see themselves in the Palestinian people. Okay, whereas boomers are much more likely to be white and they see Israel in themselves. Okay, then of course you have the evangelical Christians. Boomers are 18% of boomers are evangelical versus 9% of Gen Z are evangelical. Twice as many boomers. Evangelicals are the most pro-Israel Americans by far. Okay, so and then you also have religiosity. The younger the generation, the less likely they are to be religious. And religious people, we're talking religious Christians, right? They're also steeped in these eschatological beliefs about the Jews all gathering in Israel at the end of days. So, you have a range of factors, and there isn't a single thing, but there's no doubt that the boomer generation is dramatically more supportive of Israel, much more likely to be plugged in to the Israeli suffering, and much, much less likely to be plugged into the Palestinian suffering.
You've said a lot there. Let's start to unpack some of these things. So there's this young versus old dichotomy that you talked about, and that classically in older people, or the boomers as you put them, the fault lines would usually be Fox versus MSNBC or Fox versus CNN or whatever. And that was the difference between the sort of the more Republican-leaning boomers and the more Democrat-leaning boomers. The blue, no matter what types, and then the Christian older sort of generation. We'll get to the race and the sort of the roles that race and religion play and religiosity play into this decision making. But in the young versus old narrative, right? Do you see a lot of the younger people and their activism? Right, you said it as best as it could be said, that they're following Motaz, they're following Bissam, they're following Blistia, and they're watching all these young, people of color who are their age in Palestine on the ground, facing the brunt of the military machinery, coming forward from Israel, which was provided via America. And they see themselves in the Palestinian people, and they can associate with the cause. Do you see that for the young people translating over into a ballot box? Do you see that going into do you see their activism going on to the 2024 elections in the United States? Because with the boomers, you see, they're big on voting because they still believe in the system. That's a big problem. That with a lot of the millennials and the Zoomer generation, the younger Gen Z people, they've stopped believing in the system, right? They've stopped because the system has not provided for them economically. There's not enough jobs to go around. Maybe they're steeped under student loans. The boomers really believe in the system, and they really believe in Trump on the one hand, and on the other hand, they believe in whatever the Democratic Party has to serve up. So they're going to go for the ballot box. They're going to go vote for their Kamalas and their Bidens and their Trumps and their Vivek Ramaswamis, who recently dropped out, by the way, and their whoever. But the young people, do you think this is going to be a big thing on the ticket? Do you think that candidates will try to appeal to these younger voters? Because I feel like young activism tends to dissipate very quickly. The energy tends to be wasted. Do we see this on the ballot box, the Palestine issue, or just an anti-war sentiment this time around?
The unfortunate reality is that young people don't vote. Young people between the ages of 18 and 30 are least likely to show up to the polls, and old people are most likely to show up to the polls. That is the reality. It's always been that way, and it probably always will be that way. And I think the reasons are fairly obvious. If you are 60, 70, 80 years old and you rely on a social security check every month, you rely on Medicaid, the decisions made by your elected officials have a direct effect on your day-to-day life. The size of your paycheck every month is a function of who's sitting in the office of the president of the United States of America. If you're 19, 20, 21, you're probably in good health. You're not collecting a social security check, or you're not on Medicaid. You're probably still in your parents' insurance plans. And on top of all that, you don't really see these leaders. You see the leaders running for these political parties as totally disconnected from you. We're talking about octogenarians. You're talking about, an 81-year-old versus an 83-year-old. I mean, who people who literally grew up in the 1940s. It just people who are totally disconnected from you. And by the way, they were the same people who ran 4 years ago. And you're just like, I can't believe this is happening again. Two octogenarians running face to face in 2020. The same two goddamn octogenarians running again in 2024. Like you're just like in disbelief that these are the people that my country is putting up for president of the United States. It's unreal. I mean, and so young people don't vote. And I think what will happen this election will be that there'll be there's so much distrust in institutions these days. Okay. Especially, look on the MAGA right, the Trump loving right. I think disillusion in institutions would be a dramatic understatement. You have literally tens of millions of Americans. I don't know if it's 20 million or 50 million or 70 million, but you have tens of millions of Americans who believe that the election in 2020 was stolen. It was the freest and fairest election in American history, according, I think, to almost every election observer. There was literally almost no fraud at all. Like, you can count the number of fraudulent ballots. We're talking in a country of 330 million people. You can literally count the number of fraudulent ballots on like one or two hands. It was incredibly free, incredibly fair. And yet you have a massive swath of this country that believes the election was stolen. So that's one side. And then on the left, you have basically young people who are overwhelmingly in support of ceasefire. 60+% of Americans support a ceasefire. And yet they see the elected representatives sitting in Congress, and they see the president of the United States banging on Israel's war drum. More bombs, more drones, more dead Palestinians. And they're supposed to want to go show up to the polls and vote. They have Biden, who on the 100-day anniversary of the October 7th massacre, you have Biden saying after 23,000 Palestinians have been slaughtered, after you have 1.9 million Palestinians displaced, 90% of the people in Gaza have been made homeless, sleeping out in the open air, starving, dehydrating, all because of Israeli military actions, all because of the siege and the blockade and the aerial bombardment. You have Biden go out and release a statement saying, we call for an immediate release of the 112 hostages, not mentioning a single word of the millions of Palestinians displaced, tens of thousands murdered, not a single word. And that's Biden. And then you have the Republicans criticizing Biden for not being supportive enough of Israel. And you're supposed to want to show up to the polls in November when that is what you're looking at? In my view, young people are just not going to show up. They're not going to show up to the polls. I mean, it's so obvious. They're going to be like, To hell with this fucking system. To hell with these stupid political parties. I think what might happen is you'll see the rise of a third party candidate.
No way.
I don't know if that's
No way. I don't believe you.
You
Third
don't
party
believe
in
me.
America, it's not possible. It's not. Who Jill Stein? Who are they going to vote for?
Look, it could be RFK Jr.
RFK Jr. has
It
been
could.
really bad with Israel. If we're going to talk about RFK
I
Jr.
know.
specifically,
I know.
he had a
No, I don't
he
think.
had a deep love
I
for
don't.
the Israelis, and he thinks that. So I couldn't help myself. But he just completely went all Zionist. I mean, considering the legacy that he carries with his father and his uncle, I mean, one would expect that he would be anti-war. This is the thing. As a third world sort of observer, I have no skin in the game except that if it doesn't work out, you're gonna kill all of us. That's the only skin in the game that I have. And then the dollar thing that we talked about the last time, that we all have to buy in dollars and trade in dollars. That's the only skin I have in the game in the American elections. Every time you have an anti-war candidate, right? They'll say the right things. You know, they talk about the Ukraine and they were opposed to the war in Ukraine from the first day. I mean, Trump even, walked back his whole stance on Iraq, and he said, if you want to know, ask Sean Hannity. He knows. I told him in secret. And even though everyone knows Trump was openly for the war back in the day, but fine, he walked back his stance on Iraq, and everybody knows Iraq was bad and Afghanistan was bad, and all of it was a nightmare. Why is it that across the board, in lockstep, every single candidate for the Republican Party, every single candidate for the Democrat Party, without fail, had to show just unconditional support for Israel? Is the Israeli lobby so powerful in the American electoral process? And I know I'm saying this to you as a Jew, and this is not meant to offend, but because this is the thing. They've coupled this with Judaism in a way that it becomes anti-Semitism when you try to criticize the effects of the Israel lobby. But even with RFK Jr., even with him, even if he were to become a third party candidate, it seems impossible that he would have an anti-war or at least an acceptable, reasonable stance on Israel and the massacre that's happening in Gaza.
I think there is one saving grace with RFK Jr. is that he openly talks about the problem with the pharmaceutical industrial complex as well as the military industrial complex. And I think that is unique among presidential candidates. No one is talking about those problems. And I think when you dig deep and look at why is the United States government so pro-war, so pro-Israel, I do think the military industrial complex plays a big role. You have an organization called Who Profits, and the organization documents the 100+ U.S. Companies. Most of them, we're talking about, multi-million, multi-billion-dollar multinational conglomerates that are based in the U.S., publicly traded companies, many of them, that benefit tremendously from war, and specifically Israel's wars on Gaza and the Palestinian people more broadly. Caterpillar, Lockheed Martin, all the big weapons manufacturers, right? They sell they sell weapons to Israel and benefit tremendously from those weapons sales, and have a huge impact in Washington. I don't know the exact dollar amount that is spent on lobbying from the weapons manufacturing lobbies, but it's enormous. We're talking probably 100 million plus a year. Then, of course, you have the AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, which, again, just to give you a sense of, how important they are. So, Rashida Tlaib, after in the weeks following October 7th, she came out with a statement, basically, saying Israel should stop dropping bombs on Gaza because it is indiscriminately targeting innocent civilians, and that's a war crime, and Israel should immediately cease the aerial bombardment. In response to that, so it was a message basically calling for an end to killing innocent people. In response to that, the U.S. Congress censured her, okay? And they've only ever censured something like 20-something individuals in the entire history of the U.S. Congress. So we're talking 300 years of history. In the entire history, they've only censured 26 people for things like accepting bribes, for things like sexual transgression, sexual misconduct. And now you can add to that list,
Actually, if I'm
calling on the government, yeah, go
If
ahead.
I'm not wrong, Teddy Roosevelt was also sanctioned by the Congress because there was some black activist that he used to have dinner with, and then Teddy Roosevelt, because he was the way he was, he doubled down, and he kept, he did like a speaking tour with that guy. I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking on the story, and I'm probably butchering American history right now, but yeah, you're right. I mean, people generally tend to get censored for much worse, than asking for not slaughtering innocent people.
So yeah, so in addition to bribery and sexual transgressions, we can add to the list of grave offenses that have been censured by the U.S. Congress. We can add to that list of grave offenses speaking out against the risk of genocide. So that is where the U.S. Congress is at. And then to top it all off, to get back to the Israel lobby question, the AIPAC, basically the strongest pro-Israel lobbying organization in Washington. They've launched a campaign to unseat Rashida Tlaib. I don't know if you're following this, but two individual. You have Hill Harper, as well as Nasser Beydoun, who are both Michigan-based Democrats. I think one is running for a U.S. Senate seat, and the other might be running for a state race. I can't recall which one. AIPAC has offered both of them $20 million in campaign contributions to run against Rashida Tlaib in the Democratic primary. They are literally offering candidates $20 million in campaign contributions. They will back candidates to unseat Tlaib. And they've both, obviously, first of all, come forward with this knowledge and told the world about it, because obviously AIPAC doesn't want people to know that they're doing this. This is all behind closed doors. So the candidates not only have come forward and said, I am being offered $20 million, but the candidates also basically said, look, we're not even really that pro-Israel. Like, you're not even finding people who are like super pro-Israel. They're just like kind of middle of the road Dems who don't really have a horse in the race, and they're the ones being offered the money. Okay, so imagine how tough it is for AIPAC to find people to try to run against Tlaib. But this is where we're at, right? Where basically there is a culture of fear. There's a culture of, I'm going to lose my congressional seat or my Senate seat if I speak out, and that's exactly what's happening.
And it's not just in politics. I can imagine this story about Nasser Beydoun and Hill Harper. I didn't know the exact details, unfortunately, but I'm glad you brought them up. That the candidates themselves were willing to make public what was private. That they were being offered $20 million per piece to run against Rashida Tlaib to oust her from her position. Don't you think, as an American, that's insane that a foreign agent, and that's what they are, right? They're foreign agents. They're basically lobbying for another country to have that much sway in the American Congress, in the American Senate. Why don't you see...
It's a classic... Yeah.
Sorry. Why don't
Go
you
ahead,
see
I'm
more
sorry.
of a... So it's fine. Why don't you see more of a sort of like an outrage from the American people? I mean, is the narrative that it's our greatest ally, Israel's our bulwark in the Middle East, and to quote your beloved RFK Jr., he said that, imagine Israel is like an aircraft carrier for us right there in the Middle East. That's what he recently said about it, by the way. I mean, his support for Israel, if you ask my honest opinion, killed his presidential campaign. It completely killed his presidential campaign. And you see them, they're just bending over backwards, all of them, to sort of who can shout the loudest for the Israeli people, for the Israeli cause. It just doesn't it enrage you as an American? Don't younger people feel the need to? Is it that America is decadent enough where the young people don't have to think about a lot of their like day-to-day affairs, but at the same time they're so disillusioned with the institutions that they don't care about the elections? I mean, is it one or the other, or is it both? Like, don't they get incensed by the idea that our presidential candidates are spending their time not talking about the opium epidemic, not talking about jobs, not talking about student debt, not talking about foreign debt, not talking about industry moving to China and India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and God knows where. They're talking about Israel. Doesn't that piss people off?
The number one question I get from young Americans is, why is the U.S. so pro-Israel? They actually don't understand it. They're just very confused, because they turn on Instagram, they open up TikTok, and what do they see? They see images of entire Palestinian neighborhoods completely blown to pieces with American bombs. And they're just so confused. Like, None of this makes any sense. What is happening? How is it that our country is complicit in a genocide? It literally makes no sense to them. And because it doesn't make sense, I think that you're exactly correct. Everything you're saying is 100% correct. You have young people who basically this country has never been stacked against young people in the same way it is today. It's never been more difficult to be a homeowner today than in the past. And if you think about what do young people care about, if you're 18, 20, 22, 24, what is it that you aspire to in life? Well, you want to find a partner. There's tremendously less people getting married today than there were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's actually an epidemic, people are calling it, that basically, young men are not finding mates. They're and marriage is less common today than it was before. So basically, the idea of being in a loving, caring relationship is kind of slipping away. And we can talk about that. That's a whole nother question. The idea of owning a home is slipping away. Home prices relative to salaries has never been, home prices have never been more unaffordable than they are today. The average homeowner today is, I think, over the age of 50. If you go back 40 years, the average homeowner was 30, right? So young people used to buy homes. Today, old people buy homes because young people can't afford homes. So they've given up the idea of ever owning a home. They've given up the idea basically of ever being able to pay back their student debt. Because now college, if you look at the price of university, prices of university goes up 5, 6, 7, 8% a year. So basically, few things in life have the price of which has risen faster than inflation. Basically, you have healthcare expenses, home prices, and education. Those three things have become totally unaffordable. And young people obviously need an education to basically find jobs and excel in life and accelerate their careers. So basically, young people are being relationships, jobs, homes, education, everything is becoming unaffordable. And then they look at the political situation and they look at our political institutions, and they're totally disgusted with what they see. None of these people represent them at all, not in terms of their age, not in terms of their race, not in terms of their ethnic background. So they're disconnected from their elected representatives. And then they're also, I think, just totally, kind of disconnected, just from the political conversations that are just not connected to their day-to-day realities. So I think when it comes to Israel Palestine, the situation is even worse, right? Where they turn on the news they open up their social apps and can watch genocide unfolding in real time, and then hear their elected representatives talking about how we need to send more missiles and send more military support to Israel. It's a really sad state of affairs. You're absolutely right, and I think in general that's going to lead to young people to choose not to show up to the polls in November.
Further disillusionment with the process. I mean, you mentioned the social media apps and these young people going on and seeing their elected representatives talk about the conflict, which they can see, by the way. They can live stream directly to Gaza. So they have an idea of what's going on ground. Do you think that was the source of things like letters to America, or Letter to America, which was the Osama bin Laden letter that became really popular on TikTok? Did you see that? That was insane, right? That young people, especially like Zoomers, were like, "Hey guys, there was this guy in the desert. He kind of made sense about maybe we're the baddies." You saw that becoming popular. Then eventually, TikTok had to ban the trend. But these kinds of sort of anti-imperialistic trends coming up from young people finding solace in, or finding at least some sort of sense in what Osama bin Laden has to say about the American empire and the imperial project. It's insane, right? I mean, do older people not realize the sort of chokehold they have on finance and on home ownership and the kind of voting that the elder generation has done has led to this point? Yeah, I mean, people were all for the Iraq and Afghan war. I mean, they were not to disparage the people who protested the wars, but it was not much compared to the sort of resounding support you had for these things post 9/11. And now again, you're seeing a potential, if not global, a regional conflagration with what's going on in Yemen. I mean, with the sort of attacks that have been going on from Irani-backed militias in Iraq and in Syria. You see them attacking U.S. interests and air bases. I think about 60% of Syria is occupied. Sorry, 40% of Syria is occupied. The oil fields primarily are occupied by the U.S. Army. Are young people or voters or the average American citizen, are they even aware of these things? Or are they even interested? I mean, isn't everyone sort of by a couple of degrees of separation related to someone who went to Iraq, who went to Afghanistan? I mean, young people who were in the army, don't they feel that sort of pressure that it's going to be us again who go out and fight these wars? Potentially in Yemen, potentially in Iraq again, potentially in Syria, or even Israel?
I think that young people are not very aware of the Iraq war or of the Afghanistan war. He came of age after the U.S. had already launched those wars, and honestly probably didn't really understand why we were fighting them in the first place. I think certainly now looking back, I mean, even Afghanistan. I mean, even a country that housed Al Qaeda, that provided a base for that organization to carry out those attacks. I mean, within. There was never any problem, pushing them underground. But even from the beginning, from the early years of that war, we knew that the reporting coming out of Afghanistan was that it's going to, we're going to have to stay there for longer. We're going to have to double down and send more troops and, to take over. It was clear from the early years of that occupation that it was not going well. And it took 20 years for us to realize that we needed to end that occupation and get the hell out of there. And then, of course, Iraq was even worse. And from the beginning, it was a catastrophe. I mean, from the early months of the war, George Bush, mission accomplished, right? And then, you have the most intense insurgency. More than 1 million Iraqis killed in the past 15, 20 years? More than 1 million? What is that? 10% of the entire country killed as a result of our invasion? I mean, it's one of the most shameful American wars in American history. And yet here we are basically saying, and then you brought up Yemen. The U.S. supported the Saudi-led coalition for 5-6 years. And Yemen, up until this most recent war on Gaza, Yemen was one of the world's, if not the world's, #1 humanitarian catastrophe, right? For more than 5 years, you had masses of Yemenis dying from starvation. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of people in Yemen died from starvation or starvation-related diseases or dehydration. Or armed conflict, so, and this was a war funded and supported by the U.S. And now we're re-engaging. We think, after that war failed, after the United States and Saudi Arabia failed to unseat the Ansar Allah, failed to unseat the Houthis, after 5, 6, 7 years, the Saudis were like, well, we tried that. That didn't work. We killed however many tens of thousands of Yemenis. That didn't work. They're still in power. They're still in control of the majority of the country, or at least the majority of the people that live in the country. And here the U.S. is thinking, let's go re-engage. Let's reignite another Yemen war. I mean, it's total insanity.
I mean, you talked about Afghanistan and you couldn't help you were laughing yourself thinking about the Afghan war and how ridiculous it all was. I like to bring to the audience's attention that before the war started, the Taliban regime had actually offered up Osama bin Laden under 3 conditions. And if I'm not wrong, if I'm remembering correctly, one was that either Pakistan and Saudi Arabia testify that he was responsible for the attacks and that he should be tried and punished in America, or they provide the evidence that he's done it and that they try and punish him in Afghanistan. And I think the third was common arbitration, and then that they would figure out what to do with him. But the Americans were like, no, we're invading. And in the end, he wasn't even there. He was here, right here in Pakistan. He was in Abbottabad, which is not far from where I am, by the way.
That's funny.
I've been to Abbottabad. It's nice mountain location. It's nice tourist destination. It's pretty sweet. So, I mean, apparently that during the Clinton administration, as well and subsequently in the Bush administration, they had multiple opportunities to take him out. In a lot of intelligence, in the tell-all books that people tend to write after their retirements, they do mention 3 or 4 occasions, and the audience can check up online, They had the opportunity to take him out because he was a high value target even prior to the 9/11 attacks, but they never did.
It was.
They never did, and at one point, in the Rambo 3 days, the Afghan people, the Al Qaeda, everybody, they were heroes, and the American people loved them, and the Christian right, presented them as holy warriors against the Soviet occupation. Um, I didn't turn out too great, did it? But then eventually, you guys get into Afghanistan, you guys get into Iraq, like you said, one of the most shameful post Vietnam, one of the most shameful sort of American misadventures in Asia, and just absolutely. But it's just this amazing ability for Americans to forget, which is just what just shocks me. I mean, I don't know what it is about here in the third world. We know exactly when we've screwed up, and and the collective, like, we don't have this collective amnesia with regards to the sort of the misgivings of our own people throughout history, and even our recent regimes, and even in the here and now, we know exactly what's going on, when it's going on, what segment of society is supporting it. As a whole, why is it that the American people, boomers, young people, whoever, white, black, colored people, rich, poor, whatever, why is it that they don't feel any collective responsibility for the actions taken in their name in the international world? Is it the feeling of isolation? Like, America is literally an island unto itself. Like, is it that? Is it the economic independence? Is it something about the American sort of the lifestyle, about Americana, that just doesn't allow people to think beyond the sort of scope of the American, I don't know, their own little dream? What is it?
There's so many issues at play. I think, first of all, your average American knows very, very, very little about the rest of the world. Okay. Many Americans do not have passports. Many Americans have never traveled outside of their home state, let alone the country. They're not aware. They just have no idea. You recall those surveys that came out in the aftermath of the Iraq War, identify Iraq on a map. And you had 30-40% Americans who could not identify Iraq on a map. Okay. Leaving aside Afghanistan. I mean, what does your average American know about Afghanistan? Zero. Okay. The same is true of Yemen. The same is true of Syria and of Iran. And honestly, of Israel, Palestine as well. There's just so little awareness. And so as a result of that, and what you have instead is you have the blob, the Washington blob, this circus of foreign policy, quote unquote, experts banging the war drums, who are funded oftentimes by the weapons lobby, who are funded by the Israel lobby, who are funded by the war lobby. And, and these people, you have Senator Lindsey Graham calling for us to bomb Iran.
Yeah.
Like, you actually, it is literally your desire to start World War III. Okay. So you have the Washington blob, the foreign policy blob that has an outsized impact, while at the same time, the American public is totally unaware and so doesn't have an opinion. That's a big problem, a big, big problem. Though this is the nature of American politics, where money and lobbies play an outsized role. And it's not just, by the way, it's not just foreign policy. It's every issue, right? We have this problem with the gun lobby. When you ask average Americans, like, should it be easy to get an automatic weapon, an assault rifle? The answer to everyone is no. There should be checks and balances. There should be background checks. It should be hard. You should have to prove you take a course and, make sure that you've not been, institutionalized in an insane asylum. There should be checks, and yet there aren't. So, and that's true of the gun lobby. And then look at abortion, where, you have this massive lobby. The vast majority of Americans obviously support abortion. And yet here we have, a Congress and a Supreme Court that is basically, making it harder to get abortion. So it's on every issue, right? The foreign policy is not unique, but the impact and the influence of the lobby on every issue is outsized. And so what it does is it creates, it allows small interest groups to have an outsized impact. So that's a big problem. But look, I think the other big issue here is that we don't have to pay for the war. At least the current, the current government, when we decide, let's send another $14 billion off to Israel, let's send another billion or 2 billion or 5 billion off to Ukraine. Let's drop $100 million in arms, and drop 100 bombs on Yemen, and spend $100 million in 15 seconds. We're not paying for that. Okay. The United States runs a deficit every year, and that deficit is getting bigger and bigger. We're not paying. We're not balancing the budget. What is the 35 trillion by now? 40 trillion? It's hard to keep track. It
Roughly.
goes up by like a couple hundred billion every month. But we don't, so in a world where we don't have to pay for the war, there's no consequences. There are no consequences to our actions. Um, and so as a result, they don't see any problem in spending more money on more weapons and more guns and more military aid to more countries involved in more conflicts. And this is where we are today. And it's a huge problem. And I think ultimately the solution to that problem is, I think eventually when we're unable to fund our own social security, when we're unable, when students are unable to pay back their debt, when it will become totally unaffordable for young people to buy homes, when they won't be able to afford their healthcare expenses, eventually they're going to wake up. And we're getting there. We're getting there. And we're just not quite there yet.
So
We still live in this fantasy world where we can spend as much money as we want, drop as many bombs as we want, and outsource the cost to the rest of the world.
I mean, how long do you think that America is going to be able to? I mean, it's the most successful empire in terms of in human history, in terms of the fact that it was able to leverage its own debt, its own uh, imbalance of trade, deficit. It was able to leverage that against the world by printing dollars, by having the world trade in dollars, and the petrodollar basically is what kept the party going, right? Post World War II, and maybe even after that. Um, don't you see that coming to a close? I mean, even you say we're almost there. We're almost there. Where we're going to figure out that you can't keep printing money to pay for foreign wars. You can't keep printing money to pay for weapons manufacturers. Because a lot of this aid, this military aid, is just paid directly via that country back to American war manufacturers, right? To Boeing, to Raytheon, to your Lockheed Martins, to Caterpillar, for example, which provides more field machinery than weaponry, but still is part of the war process. Do you think that? Do you think that there's going to be a mass of de-dollarization that's going to happen? Because over here in the third world, we do discuss that America is stepping back from the number one, position, is making a strategic retreat. You see a repealing of globalization. And Yemen, by the way, attacking the Ansar Allah, attacking the sort of trade routes, the maritime trade routes like that is a sign of what's to come. Like I joke around with my friends sometimes that on 7th October, Hamas killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's what they did. They basically, they've sort of triggered this situation where the UN-based rules, the world order with rules, and it's a liberal world order, and everybody's going to be specialized. Pakistan is going to make wheat, and Russia's going to make oil, and America's going to export all this IP and IT infrastructure, and nobody's going to fight any wars because it's just going to be impossible to take the blowback from all the trade breaking down because of the war. That didn't work out from the get go. Vietnam, Cambodia, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. The rules based order never worked. I mean, the UN is a joke. The only difference is between the UN and its efficacy and effectiveness and maybe the League of Nations is that the UN has a lot of social engineering programs with NGOs, and so it has its arms deep into like third world countries in terms of like health programs and women's development programs and all these things. But in terms of the actual policy making and the thing that it was supposed to do was to maintain global peace, it didn't end up doing it. Do you think that this series of events that has happened, COVID, um, the Ukraine war, the Hamas attack on Israel, and then subsequently the 2 billion co-religionists for the people of Palestine are suddenly all of a sudden laser focused on this situation. Do you think this series of events are just like they're symptoms of a much bigger problem, or they're the beginning of the end of this sort of globalization period where all maritime and all land routes and all air routes to trade were secure? And now we're going to see this sort of repealing of because maybe the Americans are done with globalization because all the benefit of globalization has gone to China, right? With them taking up all the jobs and all the productivity and all the factory jobs. And please go ahead.
I think the key question here is for how much longer will the United States be able to run these deficits, these budget deficits, whereby we spend more than we make? We spend more than we're able to collect in tax revenues. And that's been the case for many decades, but it's getting worse and worse and worse. While at the same time, our liabilities, our social programs are running dry. And so I think that this is a key question. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that the United States is still very much, controls the world's reserve currency. And I think that is becoming most evident, for example, if you look at stable coins. So stable coins run on crypto rails, and basically 99% of stable coins are US dollar stable coins rather than euro stable coins or Chinese yuan stable coins or even gold backed stable coins, right? Everyone wants US dollars. If you go to Argentina, if you go to Lebanon, if you go to El Salvador, if you go to Panama, you go to countries that have basically, their own local currencies have hyperinflated away. They embrace the U.S. dollar. They're not going on a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard. They're embracing the U.S. dollar, and that's because there is no alternative right now, right? No one trusts the Chinese yuan. You can't trust a currency where there are no there is no the Chinese economy. There are no free capital flows. You can't move money in and out. So no one trusts the Chinese yuan actually as valued what the Chinese government claims it is, right? So you can't trust that currency. What are we going to go to the Japanese yen? What are we going to go to the euro? I mean, maybe the euro presents an interesting alternative, but I think what is happening, gold, are we going to go back to gold? I doubt it. I think Bitcoin presents probably the most plausible. If you look out
CBDCs?
5-10 years and the CBDCs, I think, are just reincarnations of fiat currencies with better technology. But they're fundamentally no different, right? Because if a government is in control of the issuancy and can decide how many CBDC US dollars to print or euros to print, then ultimately it's not fundamentally different than the existing system we have. But I think Bitcoin does present an interesting alternative, whereby, I think we just saw a Bitcoin ETF approved in the United States earlier this week, or was it last week? And now you have Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the most important financial institution in the world, that I think the assets under management is north of 10 trillion or something insane, right? They're the largest financial institution in the world. And Larry Fink is going on a roadshow telling everyone that they should buy Bitcoin. Okay. I mean, just the sea change, even from a year or two ago, when you had mainstream US media dismissing Bitcoin, calling it, basically a bubble for the 8th time. But basically, Bitcoin is now essentially even foreign FT, the most anti-Bitcoin publication in the world, the most mainstream, even FT published an op-ed just this past week, basically saying, Bitcoin's here to stay. I'm going to buy, the op-ed writer, the journalist who wrote that piece is like, yeah, I think it's time for me to buy some Bitcoin. So, and that's where we're at. And then there's 2024. So I do think that Bitcoin presents a very interesting alternative. Why? Because it has no issuer or backer. It's a commodity backed currency, right? It is backed by electricity, by energy, and it has no issuer. No one can control it. No one can kill it. And it's a fair currency, and that it's not one country that gets to print it. No one gets to print Bitcoin. No individual, no corporation,
Not
no
even
government.
Satoshi Nakamoto.
Not even Satoshi Nakamoto. That's an interesting question. Okay, so we could talk about Satoshi Nakamoto, but basically, I do ultimately think that that is what the world wants and that is what the world needs. Now, the world has not woken up to that realization that it's Bitcoin, that it's what the world wants and it's what the world needs. But I think eventually it will, because eventually, China doesn't want to have to, basically. Iran and China and Russia and Brazil, they don't want to have to haul oil out of the ground to get the dollars they need to buy food and to buy energy, and to buy goods and services. Whereas the United States can just push a button, print the money, and then, they have as much money as they need to buy goods and services and energy and oil and so on. So that system is unfair to everybody. As we talked about before, it's also unfair to the United States because it means, if all we have to do is push a button, then we have the financialization of our entire economy. And so our economy is now a service economy, and our economy we don't have factories. We don't have a manufacturing sector anymore. And as a result, now we have, China could basically invade Taiwan and take over access to chip manufacturing. And that would then prevent us from, and we don't have the capacity because we don't have an industrial base and we can't produce anything physically anymore. So that has hurt us and has hurt our middle class and is leading to polarization in the United States because because we've seen the hollowing out of our own middle class and our own industrial base. And so you have kind of the haves and the have-nots in the United States have never been more divided. And so it's eating away the United States from the inside. So it's bad for the United States. It's bad for the rest of the world. And so the US dollar being the world's reserve currency is bad for everybody. And yet you have this alternative currency that is now becoming mainstream. It's been accepted by mainstream financial media. It's been accepted by mainstream financial institutions in the United States. It's already been accepted by most countries in the world, I think. There are obviously some countries that are still outlawed, but basically, everyone's come to realize you can't kill it.
You can deal in Bitcoin. Yeah. No, you
So
heard it here first, people.
I think that's where we're going. I think that's where we're going.
You heard it here first. Number one, that Dr. Zachary Foster is a Bitcoin bro. And number two, the time to buy is now. There's just one was just I pointed out earlier with me name dropping Satoshi Nakamoto, the supposed founder of Bitcoin, and the idea of the blockchain being limited to a certain number of Bitcoins that's going to be the maximum number in issuancy, and they're going to be circulated, and that's going to be the entire currency. And then you'll keep breaking down the part and participle of every piece of Bitcoin, and then you saw that you did at one point it was 1 Bitcoin, and then you can own 1/10 of a Bitcoin, 100th of a Bitcoin, and most people now understand more or less how blockchain technology works and how this the division system works. I have two problems with it. Number one, it's sort of elusive source as a currency. It just spooks me because I think I have a very cynical sort of approach to all of these things. The way we've grown up, right, in a post 9/11 sort of situation, I don't view these things as what they are on surface value. I feel like there's a darker, like with you mentioning Larry Fink going around the world and talking about, if Larry Fink's going around and talking about something, I'm gonna be skeptical about it. And the other thing is things like the 51% attack. It's not possible for individuals or for groups to come up with it, but states. I mean, you saw with the Chinese, they had hydroelectric plants where they were just mining, like they had like thousands of graphic cards in those little computer things. And again, I'm not a technology guy, I can't explain exactly, but those little processor units with the graphic cards, and they were mining like I don't know how many Bitcoins a minute or something. There's a way to game these things that individuals maybe cannot, and so we run into the same sort of trap. So I don't have that much of a sort of even though I'm not supposed to say this online because it's like blasphemy or whatever, but I don't have as much trust in the idea of fiat currency being supplanted by Bitcoin or any of these sort of blockchain based cryptocurrencies. Why do you feel that is a potential alternative? And then we'll get back to the Palestine stuff.
I think the fundamental problem today is that the world needs a money that is trustworthy and is reliable, and no one has control over it, and is totally decentralized, and it is energy backed, and that's Bitcoin. And I think that the mainstreaming of Bitcoin was inevitable. It's been on a gradual course of mainstreaming since 2011 all the way to the present. People have been talking about the institutions coming in already for 6, 7, 8 years now, and finally they're here. Finally boomers can buy Bitcoin ETF and add it to their investment portfolio. That is a reality now in 2024. Ultimately, why do I think the world needs basically a neutral currency? And why is Bitcoin the only kind of world's neutral currency? There is no issuer, okay? It's in that sense, it's a commodity, right? Who is the issuer of Apple stock? Well, it's Apple. Who is the issuer of the United States dollar? Well, it's the United States government. Who is the issuer of Bitcoin? There is no issuer. There's no one that issues Bitcoin. It's just software. It's just decentralized software. It's just decentralized software.
I don't know. Okay? I don't trust computers.
Look, there's been you have now a 14-year history of no hacks, a 14-year history of no downtime, of a 14-year history that has had some bumps and hoops and hurdles and civil wars, right? We had the block size wars back in 2016, 2017, right? So there were, it's like every institution, it has had its bumps, but nevertheless, I think the longer it survives, the harder it is to kill. The
What
longer
about
it
what
survives,
about
the
the more
more
speculative
decentralized it
aspect
becomes.
that you saw in the last sort of bull run? Don't you think that was a detriment to the intrinsic value of this new currency? Don't you think there was more of it was a similar sort of like, maybe it was new for European and American markets, but you see similar sort of bull runs in the third world when it comes to owning dollars or selling and buying dollars. We have a very like a volatile currency market usually in the third world. Was was that America's, even with the GameStop, for example, and that was
Yeah.
the end of that sort of that era, and you saw NFTs coming out. Do you think that commodification and trading of that is diminishing it as a medium of exchange and that sort of value? Because when you start to do speculation, I mean, even Elon Musk, people like Elon Musk were doing, they were doing pump and dumps with Dogecoin and this and that and the other,
Yeah.
and do you think these things sort of demean the whole process and bring it down? Why is
I,
Bitcoin so different or pure or, I don't know, holier than the other cryptocurrencies, and how is it immune to this sort of, because it did go up and then it did go down, so it's not immune to the same sort of speculative gambling that the American dollar has been ruined by and Wall Street has destroyed the American economy.
so when you think about what makes money money, you look for certain properties and qualities. And over the course of human history, there have been many things that have served as money, right? If you go back to the ancient world, you had seashells and you had pearls and beads, and then you had cows and grain and
Economics, I feel
cigarettes,
like it's my
right? So,
first economics class back in the day.
so what makes money money? Okay, so that
No,
it's it should be scarce. You can't make more of it. If you can make more of it, then it's not very good money.
no.
And that's why every fiat currency eventually busts. Because eventually the issuer, the government in control of the fiat currency, issues more of it. And eventually it hyperinflates away. And then the world moves to a new money that is harder and sounder and harder to make more of. And eventually, over the course of human history, you had many, many different monies. And eventually, all major powers in the world settled on gold. Why? Because it was the hardest to make more of.
It's finite.
You couldn't make more of it. And it also, you could preserve it forever. Basically, gold is never gonna, you have gold from the ancient world. Gold will last thousands, tens of thousands of years, right? And it's also divisible. You can break it into smaller and smaller units.
Also,
Yeah,
it's
so
pretty inflation proof.
yeah, that's all about the soundness of it being it hard to make more of it.
Yeah.
So there should be no, and so no one can. So here's what you look for. Here's what everyone looks for in a money: that you can't make more of it, that it'll last forever, that it's infinitely divisible, and that you can move it across time and space at the speed of light. Now, everything I just described works for gold except the last point. And this is why Bitcoin is this is why it's described as the perfect gold, right? Because basically you can't make more of it. There's no issuer. It's not controlled by anybody. And at the same time, and it's infinitely divisible. Gold is not infinitely divisible. So it's better than it does everything that gold does. And in addition to that,
But here's my contradiction.
yeah,
Here's my little like a little jab at your whole theory.
yeah.
Because it's infinitely divisible, doesn't that make it also liable to that sort of fiat problem of being too much in supply, there's being too much supply?
There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins.
No,
Okay.
but
Now the fact,
because it's divisible, they can there's an infinite number of variations of 1/100th of a 1,000th of a whatever of a Bitcoin, right? So
so what?
doesn't that split the supply in a way where it now too can be overprinted in a sense, because you keep
No,
dividing
no,
it up into little smaller pieces,
no. That's not how it works. You could own 0.0001 Bitcoin.
right?
You could own point oh, add another 100 O's,
Sure.
one Bitcoin. It doesn't change the fact that that is a specific amount of Bitcoin
It summates
that
to
is
one
going to,
Bitcoin.
it's still, it doesn't matter how many times you divide it. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, right? So the point I'm trying to make here, just to kind of zoom back out, is that basically the, the world wants perfect money. Because money is really the foundation of society. If you really think about commerce and trade and human civilization, it's all built on the foundation of money, of being able to not have to barter goods, not have to barter for goods and services, or not have to rely on the system of trust. That basically you don't need to trust, you just need to verify. And finally, and so kind of the point I was making was, basically Bitcoin, it's you can't make more of it. There's no, basically, no one has control over it. It's totally decentralized. It's a perfect ledger. It's just a perfect ledger. That's all it is. Bitcoin is a database that can't be hacked and can't be tampered with. And that's what the world wants. That's what the world needs. That's what money is. Money is just a ledger. It's I have this much and you have that much, right? That's all it is. It's just a gigantic ledger. Now, the problem is up until now, that ledger has really, been in the control of governments, and governments have been in control of, how much money there is in existence, and which of course controls the denominator. So if any government can say, well, we're going to add another 5 billion or 100 billion or a trillion into supply, well, then it's individual governments, which ultimately means individuals, human beings, have control over the ledger, which means they're corruptible, and it means they will eventually be corrupted. Now, with Bitcoin, you basically have a ledger that is uncorruptible and can't be tampered with by humans, which is what the world wants, and it's what the world needs. They just haven't realized it for all these reasons that you're talking about. It's scary, it's new, it's I don't trust it. Is it really divisible? Is that maybe it's taking up too much energy? It takes up all the energy that Argentina takes up. Oh, it's used by Hamas. It's used by terrorists. Well, here's the thing. All technologies can be used for good and can be used for bad. Okay, all technologies at first are scary. When the light bulb was first introduced, people were like, this is going to blow up all the homes. Everyone's homes are going to burn down, and new technologies are always feared and they're always hated. And whenever they're introduced, there's always going to be a speculative bubble. And that's the case. And now what we're experiencing is for the first time in 3,000 years, there's been a new money that has been introduced into existence. And that's Bitcoin. And, it took us however many thousands of years to get to a point where every major power in the world accepted gold as money. It wasn't always the case. You go back, 1,000 years when you had Americans invade, basically, Europeans conquer the New World. They brought with them gold and silver. And guess what? The natives didn't use gold and silver as money, They had different monies. But one of the reasons they were able to conquer the indigenous peoples of the Americas was because they had better money. And better money makes for better civilization because it makes for better trade. Because money's a technology ultimately. And every kind of money has always been a technology because it's a technology that exhibits certain properties. Like we said, divisibility,
before this completely spirals out of control, it's gotten pretty esoteric already. And I honestly at this point sound like a boomer who's been shouting at by a young person to,
I don't know how we got off the rails. This was supposed to be about like Israel Palestine.
No, but it is because it's all connected in the sense that we would make for a better world. And I do agree with you on some level. I am very skeptical about Bitcoin. I'm not gonna lie, and maybe off camera I can talk to you about it more, and I'll keep floating questions about it, and I'll ask the audience if they want to have a conversation about specifically about currency and the way things operate in commerce and trade and how that contributes to human civilization. Because you are a historian, technically speaking, you are a historian, so you have a very broad perspective on this subject, and it's all interlinked because like you said that. One of the reasons why the New World was conquered so easily by the Europeans was because they had better technology, and their main technology was money. Because money makes for good trade, and good trade makes for innovation, better social organization, better division of labor and resources, and then you have the Industrial Revolution, which was the apex of sort of the human productivity. And we can agree and disagree on the effects that it has had on mankind, but we're all the better for it now in the 21st century. Speaking about global trade, we're living in this hyper interconnected world, and this will easily put us back into the conversation about Yemen and Palestine and the Arabian Sea and what's been going on for the shipping vessels. There's this war hawk that I sometimes listen to, American. He's called Peter Zeihan. Do you know about this guy? Yeah.
Yes, I do.
He's a big war-loving think tank guy, neocon type, but he has some very fascinating takes. He had a very fascinating thing about how the Americans picked up from where the sort of European colonialist empires had left off and secured the maritime routes for pretty much the whole world, right? Under the American sort of authority, and especially after the Suez crisis, it was America was the sole hegemon in the world order, right? So what it does is it leads to bigger, fatter, slower shipping vessels, right? So me or my wife, could be ordering something same day delivery, but but what that means is out of sight and out of mind for us, right? It's just this thousands of tons being carried across the Atlantic or the Arabian Sea or whatever, because of the whole shipping line system. And most people don't think about that actively. That globalization has led to this point where you and I are able to have this conversation, are able to joke about Aptabad, about OBL, right? All of this is insane. It would be inconceivable just 100 years ago to my grandparents or to your grandparents, right? I'm a Muslim, you're a Jew, you're in America, I'm in Pakistan, we're talking about OBL, we're talking about Palestine, we're talking about Bitcoin. And I think there's inevitable good in this sort of in this model for globalization. Do you think that America backing off from it, sort of, and you do see America backing off a little, classically, where you would have seen the Americans come in and defend Israel physically, with air support at least, if not ground troops and actual military presence on ground. Do you think that the Israelis burning out this last sort of this capital that they have left over with the Americans, because has Judea become a big burden on Rome? That's what I'm saying. Because when Judea became a burden on Rome, you know what the Romans did to Judea. I mean, let's not forget that you might have a big Zionist lobby in America, but the European West has a history with Judaism and the Jewish people. I mean, and certainly something you can't forget. So, zooming out on this whole globalization situation, if America backs off from its globalization deal, do we have these trade routes? Do we see the rise of piracy and privateering? Do we see, the European coast, the Mediterranean, becoming the hotbed for the Barbary slave trade again? Do we see all these things coming back in a sort of modern sort of way? Because you see in Somalia and Ethiopia and also on the west coast of Africa now, you see a lot of piracy coming back. And I'm not. This is not a joke, by the way. A lot of people think that we're joking around about this, but there's a serious chance of, and you see it with the rise of private militias as well, in the Horn of Africa. What's going on right now with all these young, militias taking over the government, overthrowing regimes. Bad or good, we can debate all day about these regimes, backed by the West. But you see this sort of situation going on. Do we see a breakdown of trade? This dream that you have about Bitcoin and it becoming the global currency and people having this opportunity at fair trade, and do you see all of this breaking down?
I do think that the next decade will be a much more violent decade than the previous decade. I think there are two forces, and it's not clear which one will win out. But you have the deflationary forces of AI and of technology; those will march ahead. But then you also have the inflationary forces like war, which, as we've been talking about, seems to be only on the rise, right? I mean, let's just take the case of Russia and Ukraine. That war does not seem to be ending anytime soon. The Ukrainians are just as dug into their heels as they were a year ago, and yet they're losing support from the West. They are losing money and diplomatic aid from the West, and they're losing troops on the battlefield. And experts are now talking about how Russia has a huge military advantage. Their population is 5 times as large. They have huge stocks of weapons. They are able to fight for much longer. And when you're talking about two sides kind of dug into their heels, kind of trench warfare, numbers matter, and bombs matter, and the number of tank shells matter. And Russia has the advantage in all of those respects. And so that war, and Russia has no desire to back down. In fact, they're only emboldened. So I think Russia will annex huge swaths of Ukraine and potentially take more of Ukraine. I don't think they'll take all of Ukraine. They have no desire to control Western Ukraine or areas of the country where you have large Ukrainian majorities, but they will take the East, and they will probably expand further. And potentially, you have, Russia could invade more countries. You have the Baltic states. You have Belarus, you have Georgia, Russia can become a bellicose country to an even greater extent than it has in the past 2 years. So that's a front that will probably result in more death and more destruction and more inflation as well. And then, of course, now you have the Middle East theater, where you have the United States dropping 100 bombs on Yemen. That could easily spiral out of control and become kind of a low-level conflict, potentially even a hot conflict for months, if not years to come. You have Israel reoccupying Gaza, which will become a essentially, I would describe that as a guerrilla war now, where you're going to have basically Hamas fighters popping out of tunnels, popping out of blown up buildings, attacking Israeli soldiers. That will continue for months, if not years. You have the West Bank exploding. You have Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel. Just was it last week or 2 weeks ago? You had Hezbollah attack one of Israel's most important military bases in the north.
Yeah, last
On
week.
Meron. In Meron, yeah, they took out one of Israel's critical military bases that is not easily replaceable. Okay, and then you have Hezbollah firing rockets into the northern towns. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced. You have Israel firing rockets. I mean, Israel speaks about re-invading Lebanon and reconquering Beirut as if it. You have Israeli cabinet members talking about that openly. We will send Beirut back to the Stone Age. I mean, just the most bellicose rhetoric coming out of Israel. Now you have Iran, firing missiles at Pakistan, firing missiles into Syria and Iraq.
There's a joke going around in the Muslim world that Iran has fired missiles into 3 countries in the past 2 weeks, and none of them are Israel. It's attacked a Kurdish base in Erbil, Iraq. It's attacked a Sunni resistance center in Syria, and it's attacked a Sunni militant factions, so-called bases in Balochistan, Pakistan. And the Pakistani state has had sort of a lukewarm response of like, we don't like that, and we shouldn't do that. And because the day off, by the way, our interim prime minister and their foreign minister had a meeting, and we're currently having joint naval exercises with them. So it's completely insane that Iran has found this opportunity to flex its sort of foreign policy muscles and settle scores under the garb of the axis of resistance, Palestinian love, or whatever, because they're not actually doing anything. I genuinely think, by the way, that Hamas caught everyone by surprise. I genuinely believe this. I genuinely believe that post the Abraham Accords and the sort of the friendship that was brokered between Israel and Saudi Arabia, between Iran and Saudi Arabia by China, and not by the West, by the way, it was done. The Palestinian cause was done. Nobody was talking about it. It had died out. The zeitgeist has sort of moved on. And at least, I mean, as a Muslim, I can sort of speak more to the sort of the rhetoric even on ground in the Muslim world. 7th October completely just reignited the whole situation, and I met with a Hamas representative who came to Pakistan. He's the representative for Iran and Turkey and Pakistan, but he's based out of Tehran. He essentially said that was the whole idea. That Hamas has no delusions with regards to the fact that we can actually win this war, but the idea is to hold out as long as we can and to sort of expose how crazy Zionism has gotten. I mean, from the get-go, Zionism is a problematic ideology, but the way that it's metastasized and reached every single segment of Israeli society. I mean, I was speaking with Dan Cohen, a journalist who's been working on ground in Israel and is currently working on a documentary that he's been working on for about a decade, by the way, which is apparently says is going to blow the lid off of Zionism in Israel, about how the sentiments are and how daily life is in Israel and how these people sort of think about the Palestinian people and their position in the Middle East. But that's what Hamas wanted. I mean, and honestly, I mean, a lot of people in the West, and probably you included, probably view them as a terrorist organization and see what they did as atrocities. But I genuinely see them as freedom fighters. I don't see at this point what else was an option for the Palestinian people, because it doesn't seem like that Israel is interested in any sort of two-state solution. I mean, people talk about it, and our interim government recently talked about it as well, that we would, and Saudis recently reiterated their point as well, that we would be willing to recognize Israel's position as a state if we were to get a guarantee that Palestine was to be a sovereign, part of this two-state solution. But I don't think the Israeli people or the Israeli cabinet or the Israeli sort of political machinery is interested in having a two-state solution. It never has been, really. I mean, we talked about the Oslo Accords the last time, and what became of Rabin? They killed him, right? The more extreme sort of elements, and now those extreme elements are in government, and people love them for it. Recently, I saw one of these. I saw two. One is this guy whose kid is still in Hamas captivity, and one is I think he's a Scottish or Irish white European man who's showed up because he is of Jewish descent. And he has nothing to do with the Middle East, culturally speaking, and his daughter was arrested by the Palestinian Hamas fighters, and they've returned him. They've returned the daughter, and he's still adamant that the bombing needs to continue. I don't see any sort of non-violent conclusion coming out of this, because I feel like Israel wants to pull Hezbollah in to a sort of regional conflict. I feel like Israel wants this to become bigger so that the Americans can swoop in and actually do something about it, because I don't think on ground Israel is getting the successes that I'd expected it would. I think the Golani brigades got their butt kicked on 7th October. And now that the statistics keep coming out and they keep reducing the number of civilians killed, and did you see the cars piled up from the concert? The Hamas doesn't have the firepower to take out those cars. They don't have Apache helicopters and missiles. And did you see the kibbutzim with burnt homes?
This is one of the greatest ironies, I think, of these war tours that the Israeli military is doing. They're taking, Jared Kushner, they're taking Elon Musk, they're taking all of these celebrities on these tours of the kibbutzim and of the cities and towns in southern Israel that were attacked by Hamas. And I think the irony of the whole situation is they come back with these horror stories. Oh my God, I saw all this destruction and damage. It was the worst of what they saw was actually carried out by the Israeli military. And it has already been confirmed by many Israeli military sources. There was a mass Hannibal order. Basically, the Israeli military is always afraid that its own soldiers, its own civilians, will be captured. And when they're captured, the only way to release them is to release a huge number of Palestinian prisoners. And so the Israeli army, literally the order was better to be killed than to be captured. That was the order. And so as a result, you had Apache helicopters, spraying bullets and dropping bombs on Israeli civilians. You had Israeli tanks, circling through these Israeli towns on October 7th, on October 8th, firing shells into civilian homes. And now you have multiple Israeli sources, not just military sources, but some of the civilians who were themselves survivors of the massacre. They themselves talked about how they were afraid not of Hamas,
Yasmin Purat.
That's exactly right.
I saw her interview. I saw her. It was insane. Yeah. She said that the shelling killed all the hostages as well as these Hamas fighters, and I think she barely survived. This poor old
that's exactly
woman.
Right.
It's insane. No, I even saw the interview with the girl with the glasses. First of all, that's a little child. The tank brigade girl, I forget what her name was. I was like, that's somebody's kid. This kid shouldn't be in the army or in a tank division. And then she was like, yeah. So the commander was like, fire at the houses. So we did. And Israeli state TV is showing this, and I was like, this is just what I felt like. This was. I was talking to my brother the other day, and I felt like the Israeli state machinery, including the mass media machine, the Hasbara and the propaganda and the intelligence wings, I think it's all very bloated now. I think after the wars with the Arabs, after they had gained complete aerial superiority, as well as intelligence-based superiority in terms of the intelligence technology and surveillance technology that they have with the Americans, I think Israeli society is bloated and corrupt at this point. They're not the same Lahi and Irgun. They don't have the same motivation, and they're not as violent, and they're not as ruthless, and they don't have the same sort of Zionist motivations. And they're not coming off the heels of the Holocaust. They don't have the same chutzpah, right? They don't have the same energy to do this. They're just like interim fighters. Like, they have no full army. Like, if you, as a Muslim, like, forget my bias, right? But when you see Hamas fighters and Hamas propaganda and Hamas sentiments, and even Gazan civilian sentiments, right? And compare that to, hundreds of thousands of Israelis fled Israel just the day of 7th October, just the day after, right? And the moment those water pipe potassium nitrate rockets come in, the Hamas joke rockets, the whole city is abandoned, and the Iron Dome and air sirens, and we were in bomb shelters, and we didn't know. It just doesn't seem like a war that Israel is going to win in the long term. You can't kill. India is a much bigger country, much bigger army, is officially nuclear armed country, even though I think Israel is also a nuclear armed country, but officially, right? India has a huge GDP. They haven't been able to deal with Kashmir. Kashmiri insurgency is nothing compared to Hamas. I mean, what is the idea? how long is this Netanyahu guy and his cabinet and all these people? How long do they want to buy? I mean, these really people are going to figure this out eventually, right? I mean,
Long-term planning has never been a forte of the IDF. The the focus has always been short-term. Because if you think long-term, you wouldn't be occupying West Bank. You wouldn't be reoccupying Gaza, right? If you think long term, you would have to realize that subjecting millions and millions of people to a brutal military occupation, denying them political rights, denying them the right to have a say in their government, denying them a right to have a say in the permit regime that controls their lives, denying them any say in, any of these things is a recipe for permanent a disaster. It's a recipe for forever wars. And Israelis kind of accept that, and this is the sad reality. They basically accept that we need to focus on basically occupation maintenance. We need to keep things quiet. We're never going to solve the problem because the Palestinians are all terrorists, and that's what Israelis believe, that they're all very hateful. They grow up thinking about one day they too will become a martyr. That is the Israeli attitude towards Palestinians, is that basically they're all violent jihadi terrorists, and there's nothing we can ever do to solve that problem. And so the only thing we can do is impose an iron wall, is build a bigger wall, is kill more terrorists, is, tighten the screws of the occupation, more checkpoints, more roadblocks, and more ethnic cleansing operations. That is basically the attitude in Israel today. And of course, there is a left that sort of dreams that one day there'll be two states. And it's not to say that left is gone, but even people on that left today, I think, have become disillusioned. And they think that basically Israel is under existential threat right now. And they're obviously delusional about that. They were never under existential threat, not on October 7th, not on October 8th, and not anytime since then. But that is the belief. And it's this kind of Holocaust trauma of the whole world is anti-Semitic and everyone wants to kill us. And the only way we can survive is if we have bigger bombs and bigger planes and more weapons and more violence. And that's the attitude. And they want to condemn themselves to a life of sort of living in a permanent state of war. And I wish it wasn't the case, but I don't see a way out. I mean, how do you convince 10 million Israelis? How do you convince, 8 million Jews living in Israel that the Palestinians just want to live a normal life? They just want freedom. They just want to vote. They just want to be able to go to school and go to work without being harassed by the Israeli military. How do you convince them that?
what is the day after looking like? I mean, you mentioned earlier before we started recording that Israel has always been, and this is a very fascinating subject, and you've written about this, and we can link the article, inshallah, in when the video is up, about how Israel has always wanted to outsource the occupation. And you saw something along those lines when the UAE said, maybe we could look into an Arab force, sort of occupying the place and sort of keeping peace. And then Jordan responded with, the Jordanian king responded with that would be any occupying force, Arab or otherwise, would be seen as an act of war. And that ties back into the earlier thing that we talked about, that they've resigned themselves to be completely hated by their neighbors, which is an insane prospect for any sort of flourishing nation to think about for their future and be like, all our neighbors hate us, so we need to be more violent. And that this political problem needs a violent military solution. About outsourcing the occupation, do you think that the day after, which is, to me, it's complete la la land, by the way, the idea that they will kill or displace 30 to 40,000 Hamas fighters. They haven't gotten a single member in leadership, by the way, in Qatar or in the actual Gaza Strip. Nobody. I mean, Sinwar is, I think, the big target for them. They really want to get Yahya. But inshallah, they won't. I mean, I'm also praying for this. They will not. And there's no chance of them actually dealing with the Hamas militarily. They've lost, as so claimed by Abu Ubaidah in his 100-day speech, they've lost over 1,000 military vehicles. I'm sure the casualties both in terms of lives lost and damage done, limbs lost, and all that sort of mental and physical trauma is being reported back into Israeli civil society, regardless of the media being clamped down on, right?
Yeah.
What is the, if you have any information on ground, or I mean, I'm not asking for punditry here. I mean, just give your best educated guess. What is the outcome that Israel is looking for? Do they want to keep occupying Gaza? Is it just rhetoric? Because you do hear it coming out of the politicians that, oh, we're going to reoccupy Gaza, we're going to rebuild the kibbutzes in Gaza. Completely delusional. Is it that they want maybe the Egyptians to do the dirty work, or the Emiratis or the Saudis? What is it? Is it that they want to pull the Americans in? What does the day after look like? What do the Israelis want it to look like? And what do you think will it actually look like?
Well, I think it's quite obvious what the Israelis want. They want to expel every single last Palestinian from Gaza to Egypt, to Europe, to Africa, send them out of Gaza, get them away. That is the goal. They've encountered quite a lot of resistance. Egypt is obviously dead set against that. You even saw protests in Egypt. Protesters chanting, actually criticizing Egypt for not allowing a more humanitarian aid in. In fact, so
Yeah.
I think that is a very, very volatile situation there. But anyways, what does Israel want? Well, Israel wants Israel wants a Gaza without the Gazans. Israel wants control of the territory without the people on it. And I mean that's what Israel wants in the West Bank as well. It's what Israel wants in Jerusalem as well. Actually, it's what Israel wants inside Israel proper as well. That is ultimately what Zionism is all about. It's the land, taking control of the land without the people living on it, without the indigenous inhabitants living on it. But as far as what is practical, what do I think will happen? I think this is a forever war. I think this is now a trite thing to say, but Netanyahu, if he loses, if the war ends, he will be voted out of office. 80+% of Israelis believe he should be removed from office after the end of the war, which means the war will never end. Which means this will be a kind of a low level. I think what Netanyahu envisages is a kind of a low level military occupation in which between 1 to 4 Israeli soldiers die every day. In which, between 5 to 10 Hamas fighters are killed every day. In which there is effectively an ongoing humanitarian crisis, in which every day tens, the headline will be the OCHA, the United Nations branch that is reporting out every day on the casualty counts. Every day they will report, 100 more people in Gaza die from starvation. 500 more people contract typhoid. 5,000 more people contract this godforsaken waterborne illness. 100,000 more people are displaced. This will be the headline every day, I think, for the foreseeable future. I don't think that this conflict will end in the near future. So I think you'll have this kind of low-level occupation. Israel will try its best to find Palestinians from Gaza who are willing to act as Israel's subcontractors. Because ultimately, there will need to be basic services provided to the population, right? There ultimately will need to be, basic healthcare. There will need to be some kind of basic municipal services provided, right? Garbage collection, street cleaning, right? Israel is not going to want to do the day-to-day grunt work of reoccupying Gaza.
Fatah and the PLO did that for them for a while, but I don't think the Palestinian people will accept Fatah and the PLO anymore.
No, I don't think it will be Fatah or the PLO. I think they're going to try and find Palestinians in Gaza, kind of unaffiliated Palestinians, maybe heads of families, maybe heads of big family units, heads, basically people of influence who haven't been killed. I mean, that's what they did in the 70s. You asked this question of kind of, how did they, when Israel first decided on June 18th, 19th, it decided that it was going to basically June 18th, 19th, 1967. So we're talking 2 weeks after the end of the 1967 war. Israel made the decision, we're going to indefinitely occupy Gaza and the West Bank. That was a decision made. And so immediately the question was, well, how do you actually manage the population? And the response that was provided by the Israeli military was, we're going to try and find Palestinians who have influence, who have power, who are come from prominent families, and we're going to give them access to resources. We're going to give them control of aid distribution. We're going to give them, certain powers. Local policing. We'll give them some like light arms, prop them up. And it did that and it was just one after another, a policy of really a decade and a half of failure, right? In 1972, I believe, or 1971, the Israeli military chooses this guy, Rashad Shoah, in Gaza to be the mayor of Gaza. And then they present him with the task of integrating the Shatta refugee camp into Gaza City, which is interpreted by Palestinians as basically erasing the camp as a refugee camp, of trying to erase the idea that the residents were refugees. And so he rejects this proposal, and the Israelis dismiss him. And then a year later, this Israeli military governor tries to find other Palestinians in the Shatta refugee camp to form a committee that would basically integrate the camp into Gaza City. And what happens? The head of the committee is assassinated. All the rest of the members of the committee basically resign immediately out of the desire not to also be assassinated. And then the same thing happens in the 70s. Israel allows for municipal elections. The pro-PLO candidates win. And then in 2 years later, in 1978, Israel has this brilliant idea of establishing village committees where they bypass the elected representatives of the Palestinian people, empower these local leaders who are basically pro-Jordanian, who are basically willing to take orders from the Israeli military. And after a few years, those are also discredited because they're unelected and they have no legitimacy. This is the history of the Israeli military's adventures in the West Bank and Gaza. It's trying to subvert democratic will, empower people who have no legitimacy, and it always ends in failure.
So we just discussed the fantasy that the Israeli military and the political class have with regards to how they'll manage or outsource the day-to-day runnings of the Gaza Strip and potentially the West Bank. Considering that is where they stand and that's where they've always stood, this delusion that we all have across the world that people keep still talking about, and not just on the street level. I mean, the flipping Pakistani interim prime minister talked about it, the two-state solution. It's a complete fantasy. Dr. Khalid Kadumi speaks like 4 or 5 languages, by the way, the Hamas representative. He spoke to us in fluent Urdu, which is very impressive.
Wow.
Yeah, Persian, Turkish, English, Urdu. The guy was insane. He was displaced out of Palestine, out of Gaza when he was like 6. So he's grown up in Kuwait and Bahrain and Pakistan and here and there. So he's been all over. Real fascinating character. He essentially says to us, and then by the way, eventually he recently was some lobby group ended up taking him to the prime minister. And apparently the prime minister behind closed doors has had a 180. Again, this is an interim prime minister. He's not elected. Nobody cares. But he comes out and talks about the two-state solution. You know what Dr. Khalid Kadumi said in one of these press meetings with local civil society and journalists? He said, don't stab us. And he used an Urdu metaphor, which is increasingly more impressive to know actual idioms in the language as opposed to just knowing the language. He said, don't stab us in the back, essentially. He said, we'll come to that. Hamas as a total political force will come to the actual negotiating table once the violence ceases. Once Israel backs off from the military occupation. Once the blockade ends. Before that, any talk of the two-state solution is delusion. And now, especially post 7th October, the sort of massacre that has been carried out, technically, upwards of 1% of the entire population of Gaza has been slaughtered. Technically, that is the actual stats on ground. Do you think there's ever going to be a negotiating table? Or do you think this will come to a resounding global or at least localized conflagration? Because you mentioned Egypt, you mentioned Jordan. Those are regimes hanging on by a thread, backed up by Western whatevers, right? Egypt is a powder keg in terms of the population crisis that it has. And they have no democratic will. The one sort of moment that they did when they elected Dr. Mohammed Morsi of the Ikhwan, which is like the sort of the parent organization for Hamas, Obama, this liberal Democrat, decided to take him out, and he died in prison, and his son was assassinated, and you have this brutal military regime, and then with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, they were put there by the British after their failures in what is now called Saudi Arabia. These regimes can't tolerate Israel anymore because their populations will they fear an Arab Spring. They fear what happened to Gaddafi. They fear what happened to the Saddam fear. I think is less for people coming from outside, but the Gaddafi sort of implosion of civil society, and that is a big fear for these dictators and for these regimes. Do you think Israel has pushed the ticket far enough with its? Do you think it's done? I personally think Israel is done as a nation state. I don't think it's going to survive the next 20, 30 years with the way it's behaving. It's just not viable. It doesn't seem viable to the mind. I mean,
Yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right. I think Israel has cornered itself and and has made it much harder on the stage of global public opinion, legitimacy. I think how many countries in history have been accused of carrying out a genocide? I mean, it's putting itself into a category of countries like the Hutus in Rwanda, and like the Germans in Namibia, and like the Ottoman Empire in World War One, and the Nazi regime against the Jews in World War II. I mean, this is the category now Israel is putting itself in, a category of countries that have carried out genocides. And I don't think it has really set in. I don't think Israelis really understand what they're doing. They're totally, again, the Israeli mentality is the whole world is anti-Semitic. We don't care. But like that mentality can't last forever. And you do need allies. You do need trading partners. You do need diplomatic support at the United Nations. And so I do think this will eventually catch up to them. I think for the time being, as long as the United States and Germany and the UK are hook, line, and sinker on board with the genocide, they're probably going to be okay in the short term. But I think in the long term, the longer the occupation persists, the longer the apartheid regime persists, the more Palestinians are killed in mass, in massacres, and through starvation. The UN published a report that that Israel is using food as a weapon of war. Okay, they are starving people intentionally. There are people who cannot access food, and when they try and access, there was a report that was published by Euro Human Rights Watch, a human rights organization, just yesterday. You had 50 people who were slaughtered as they were approaching an aid truck. They were being slaughtered as they go to the aid trucks. So what you have is a genocide, and I don't think that I don't think that this Israelis really realize what they're doing to themselves. So I think you're absolutely right. The longer this regime lasts, the harder it will be. And that will manifest itself in a wide variety of ways, right? Israeli tech sector will suffer from lack of investment because who the hell wants to invest in a country that is carrying out a genocide? I think trade will subside. I think Israel's trading partners will say to hell with this country. We are not willing to engage in trade with a country carrying out genocide. I think the BDS movement will pick up steam. More countries, more universities, more churches will decide to boycott and divest from companies profiting off Israel's occupation, apartheid, siege, and genocide. So over time, it will just become harder and harder to carry on business as usual. And ultimately, it's anyone's guess how this situation will resolve itself. I think ultimately, my hope is that Palestinians in the occupied territories will wave a white flag of basically surrender and just say, look, we give up on the idea of our own independent state. Make us citizens of Israel. And I think as soon as that happens, there will be actually I think it will be very hard for the international community then to be, tooting the two-state solution as the solution to this conflict. And when the international community abandons the two-state solution and just says, Israel, you're a one-state. There's a one-state reality that is the state of Israel that controls all the land between the river and the sea. Okay, and the only difference between the one state that you have and the one state that we hope for is that the one state you have now is an apartheid state, and the one state that we hope for is a state where all citizens are equal. And I think that framing will really become undeniable eventually. I just don't think Israel will ever withdraw from the territories. It's only entrenching its rule in the territories. And the inevitable result thus will be that this apartheid regime is just becomes a pariah state. And I think in a world where you have this pariah state that the entire world agrees is a pariah state, and that the Palestinians inside the occupied territories are just saying, make us equal, give us citizenship, let us vote for the country that controls our lives. I think eventually, Israel will have to give in. And we'll have to give these people equal rights, full rights. And I think that will be a long civil rights struggle that will play out over the course of many decades. Probably you and I will long be gone from this planet by the time that happens. These things take decades. They take centuries. I mean, Jim Crow. I mean, here we are, 100 years since Jim Crow, and you have, white nationalists, parading around. You have police brutality against black people. You have George Floyd. You have, a discrimination in housing. Racism is still alive and well in the United States, and it's been 100 years since Jim Crow. So so I don't think the situation will be all that different in Israel Palestine. It will be a long, protracted civil rights struggle in which Palestinians demand equal rights inside the single state solution, which is apparently the solution that Israel wants for itself.
I mean, this all hinges on the variable. I mean, it's a nice idea to think that humans can resolve themselves and through civil strife and disobedience and the sort of the dialectic between society. They can achieve this sort of synthesis and they can come to these sort of rational conclusions where they end up living side by side. But I think it all hinges on the idea that the Palestinian people give up on the idea of an independent state or all of historical Palestine coming back into their possession. I was recently speaking to a journalist in Pakistan. He went over to Mehtab Aziz. He went over to South Lebanon and to observe the sort of border territories and to speak with Hezbollah representatives and sort of survey the situation. He's a bit of a foreign correspondent for a local channel here, and I say a bit of a foreign correspondent because we don't have many we don't have actual foreign correspondents. Pakistani news doesn't invest too much in foreign correspondency. He said something very fascinating. He said that people from the Nakba and from the subsequent, banishings from Palestine, historical Palestine, he visited one of their famous graveyards for the Palestinian people, and they all had their names and photos and sort of murals on the graves. Some of the people would have the hammer and the sickle because they were socialists and communists, and some people had other religious symbols and imagery, and they actually mentioned the exact villages on the graves and the exact territories where they were expelled from, and how they died and how they ended up and died in subsequently in Lebanon. So he said that I don't think these people are going to forget. I don't think that the Palestinian people, the 6 or 7 million in exile all over Europe and America and in the Middle East, they're not going to forget the few million in the West Bank and in Gaza. They're not gonna, this idea that they're gonna wave the white flag and be like, all right, we'll just return to some sort of unity state called Israel Palestine or whatever, and we'll all work together in some sort of loose liberal democratic whatever. I mean, I don't see that happening because it all hinges on the idea that the Palestinian people will forget and they will give up violent military based resistance. I don't see Hamas having their will broken anytime soon. There's a reason why Israel doesn't come out with any official statistics in terms of the casualties that they have on the side of the Hamas or on their own side. The Israeli as well as the Western media seems to be very silent about Israeli casualties. I think, this is my reading of the situation, that Hamas has had a fair bit of military success on ground. And there's this anti-war activist, and he's an ex-Marine, and he used to be a UN's weapons inspector as well, a third-party weapons inspector. He even went to Iraq to help shut down a lot of their nuclear program, as well as it's not the nuclear, the chemical weapons programs before the war. Scott Ritter, do you know this guy, Scott Ritter? Scott Ritter, he's a Marine, and he was a weapons inspector. He did a lot of the military analysis on the 7th of October and then subsequently the 100 days of the war. And his assessment more or less has been that the Israelis are losing the ground battle. And And that seems to be my reading of the situation, as well as a lot of the experts that I've been listening to and seeing on ground. Um, do you think, I mean, obviously, it would be delusional to think that Hamas could just achieve a pure military victory over Israel and have that translated into a political victory just as an absolute. But on a partial level, do you think that the Israeli war machine is going to lose steam? I think it is losing steam because I don't think a lot of young people, and you saw that young person the other day who was on TikTok and on Facebook and all over social media where he protested joining the IDF and he made a big fuss about it. And
Yeah.
performative as it might have been, but that segment of society that just doesn't want to fight. I'm not saying they're not Zionists. I'm not saying they're not religious crazies. I'm just saying they don't want to fight anymore. Uh, I see that happening quicker across the board, deeper and greater in magnitude on the Israeli society. I don't see it happening in Palestine, especially in Gaza. Like, who's going to collaborate with the IDF now?
Well, I think that's the
Who's
key question, right? Is how do you expect to be able to manage the day-to-day affairs of an occupation without local Palestinians, without Gazans doing dirty work for the Israeli military? And who in their right mind, what Israeli military or political official thinks they're going to be able to convince some sheikh from Gaza to take orders from the Israeli military after the past 3 months? I mean, you could have barely found someone to do that before October 7th. Now, I think it's really a pipe dream. So I don't really see. I don't see how that's going to happen, and I haven't seen any serious proposals from any Israeli officials describing how they plan to reoccupy the strip, which is why I think that there will be this sort of low-level military conflict, and why there will just be this ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in which Israeli soldiers and Hamas fighters are killing each other, in which the people are ultimately the ones
suffering?
suffering.
This long protracted sort of, and you think the Israeli establishment is hoping that it'll slowly fizzle out and that they won't have to lose face and they can keep it going as long as as long as Netanyahu can cut a deal and get off maybe his corruption charges and secure a safe route for him and his wife and his son and whatever. I mean, Yair is not even in Israel; he's on the beach most of the time, getting his tan and working on his tan. Um, do you think that in this long protracted war, it's been 100 days and hopefully not another 100 days, but do you see foreign powers intervening in terms of putting a stop to it anytime soon? Do you see the Americans or the Europeans starting? You saw with Spain, right? You saw with France sort of taking a U-turn on its official original stance and sort of being like, maybe we should reconsider this. And do Germany, do the UK, do the United States, are they forced to reconsider their position? Maybe closer to elections, maybe after the elections.
Yeah, look, I think domestic constituencies play a key role here. In the U.S., we have an election in less than a year. That's a long time from now. But obviously, I think the Biden administration does want to wind down as many wars as possible in the run up to that election. So, yes, I think that will play a role. I don't know when the next election is in Germany or the UK, but I imagine those domestic constituencies are probably also a consideration for those for UK and German political leaders. So yes, I think wars grow increasingly unpopular over time, and that will be true in Israel. That will be true in the United States and in Germany and the UK, and in Gaza as well. So I think there will eventually be. I mean, I don't see a clean break. I don't see the one day in Israeli. I don't see one day Netanyahu saying the war's over. That will never happen. I don't see Biden getting up and saying, "Ah, Israel declares victory and destroys Hamas." That will never happen because they won't be able to destroy Hamas. You're exactly right. I just don't think that's plausible. I think they will weaken Hamas, but they will not destroy Hamas. And so there will be this sort of low level military conflict. Israel will go back to what it was doing before October 7th, which is just try and keep quiet, try and reduce the number of casualties, reduce Hamas's military capabilities, but ultimately continue the occupation, continue the aerial bombardment, just on a lower level and a lower scale. And I could see that happening for years.
You don't see actor turned President Donald Trump coming up and saying, "Mr. Netanyahu, bring down that wall." You don't see that happening. It's a very similar situation, right, with Reagan and Trump. Do you see him saying that?
It's a very interesting situation because Trump pretends to be this like anti-war candidate, right? He
Mm.
he talks about how Russia would have never invaded Ukraine had I been president, right? I mean
Yeah.
that's his motto, and yet we've never had a more pro-Israel president than Donald Trump. He recognized Israel's
Yeah.
annexation of the Golan Heights. He recognized Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem. He officially moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
His son-in-law
He
brokered the Abraham Accords.
his peace plan called Peace to Prosperity. Okay, the peace plan essentially envisioned permanent Israeli military occupation in exchange for $50 billion in Gulf aid. That was his plan. It was like, well, let's give the Palestinians 50 billion and let the Israelis pursue indefinite occupation and apartheid. That was literally the plan. So he's pro forever occupation. So he's not going to end. He's not going to. I mean, and his go through Donald Trump's cabinet, his top Israel Palestine advisors: Jason Greenblatt, Jared Kushner, David Friedman.
Yeah.
David Friedman has a history of donating money to settlements. The guy is literally pro settlement expansion and puts his money where his mouth is. That was U.S. ambassador to Israel for 4 years. Okay, so the idea that Donald Trump, is going to be any better than Biden is a fiction and a fantasy. He will give Bibi a blank check to do whatever he wants. At the same time, pretending to be this sort of anti-war candidate. But I'm sure he'll figure out a way of making sense of it to his base. But have no pretense about where Donald Trump's who he supports here.
No,
It's Israel. It's not the
don't
Palestinians.
worry. I have no pretenses sitting in Pakistan about Donald Trump and what his foreign policy is going to look like. It's a very dark take that you've given, but it's a realistic one, and I respect that you see a long, protracted sort of war that slowly de-escalates, starts to lose popularity, but there's no clean break that we're going to get here, unfortunately. What is it that the people can do? I mean, it's an unfair question to ask you, but what do you expect from the average citizen? Like you mentioned earlier that you've been writing articles, you're working on papers, doing research, and now you're developing a course, right? Where you want just individuals to come up and educate themselves with regards to the conflict and the history of the Palestinian people and the historical Palestine and Israel, and that might not be that might not translate into any sort of worldwide material benefit to them, but at least they can educate themselves on the major world issue. And for 2 billion Muslims at least, it's a big deal to be able to learn, especially from a white man. It's always something that we. It's always something that we. It's always something that we,
You said that with such a straight face.
yeah. No, I mean it's true. I mean, we need to learn the white man's science. You've been developing this course, mashallah, and so we can learn from you guys and you, as a historian, not as a white man. But what do you think the average individual should do about this? I mean, speaking to America, you're speaking to both Americans, and then you can speak separately to people in the third world, in Pakistan, and the Muslim world. What do you think individuals should do about this? Because the governments, even in the Muslim world, the regimes, it's a big deal to piss off America, right? And because America is standing behind Israel to some extent, so even regimes here are not willing to I mean, Iran will bomb everyone, but not Israel. With Yemen, it's more of an organic thing. They're a militia. They don't have much to lose. But nation states with regimes, monarchies, dictatorships, even the elected governments that we've had weak responses. It's up to the individual right now. What are you people doing in America? What do you think we should do? You have the audience. You have the floor.
First of all, educate yourself. Once you've educated yourself, educate your friends and your family and your community. And you can do that in any number of ways. You can do it over a dinner conversation. You can do it over a coffee chat. You can do it on the internet and on social media. But first, educate yourself and educate others, because truth and facts and knowledge is important. And you need to equip yourself with those truths and those facts and that knowledge in order to be able to speak articulately and coherently about what is happening in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, and really at this point, the entire world. So that's number one. And then, vote. If you live in a country where you have the right to vote, you need to vote. You know, I mean, I hate to say this, and in the U.S., it almost feels like voting is worthless and useless. But I said at the beginning of the show that young Americans are not going to vote because they're disillusioned. But that is the wrong approach. If anything, vote for a protest candidate. Make your voice known. Do not let the octogenarians dominate the agenda. Vote for a protest candidate if you do not want to vote for Biden or Trump. Okay? Because you need to speak up. Voting is how you achieve political change. And then it's not just voting, lobbying your congressman, write them emails. There's 1,000,001 nonprofits that give you the template. You just click a button. There's no work that needs to be done here, but pick up the phone, call your representatives, right? You got to speak up. Because that ultimately, public opinion matters. You think Biden is unaware that 60% of Americans are supporting a ceasefire? You think he's unaware that 80% of Gen Z are supporting the Palestinians? No, he knows. He's very well aware. He has a whole team of people dedicated to tracking public opinion. He knows it's an unpopular war. The bigger the protests, the louder the opposition to this war, the more that will impact him. So yes, speak up. That's very important. So vote, speak up, educate yourself, educate others, protest. If you really want to, go to an action. If you live in the UK, go shut down an Elbit factory. If you live in Oakland, California, go shut down the port, prevent Israeli ships from docking, support BDS, do what it is that you want to do, right? There's 1,000,001 ways to be an activist, right? And you have to choose the way that makes the most sense for you. And I'm not going to tell you whether that's voting or whether that's speaking out on social media or going on podcasts or going to an action or a protest or talking to your friends and family. There are 1,000,001 ways to make your voice known. But I do think it is incumbent about all of us who care about peace and justice to do that.
No, it's been very inspiring what you've been up to, the sort of frequency with which you've been working at disseminating this information, sharing your experience as a historian, your knowledge. Mashallah, it's been a very it's been a learning curve for all of us. We're as guilty as European or Western society of being aloof to the Palestinian cause. And it was very nice the way you put it that you need to educate yourself. It could mean a dinner conversation. It could mean a fireside, like a little chit chat over coffee or whatever. It's been very inspiring to see the protests in Europe and in America. It's been very inspiring to see the young people going and blocking off the port, people going outside Elbit factories and their offices. And the caveat you gave in the start was very nice of you to say that if you have the ability to vote in your country, because a lot of us don't even have the ability to protest, right? In Saudi, in the Emirates, you've seen a lot of the religious class that would normally, which in Muslim civil society, the religious clergy have a big role in sort of organizing, and a lot of them were arrested for giving statements or making public prayers for the Palestinian people, because again, those regimes have a certain interest in negotiating and dealing with the Israeli regime, and especially post Abraham Accords. And I mean, at this point, whenever you come up with the course, inshallah, we'll let the people know. And right now, they can reach you on your Instagram and your Twitter, right? Is that those are your main sources of communication?
Yes, that's right. That's right. My Instagram. Well, we can put the links to those social profiles in the description. But yes, Instagram and Twitter.
Right, inshallah, and we'll keep these conversations going. Hopefully, in the comments, people will let us know what they want to hear about and talk about specifically with Zachary. Zachary, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you the best of luck. And we appreciate the work that you're doing for the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause. Thank you, Zachary.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for educating us about Bitcoin as well. That was great.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks,
my pleasure. Okay, take care.
Allah Hafiz.